Parliamentary Secretary to the President of the Treasury Board.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to rise today in support of Canada's new government in its decision to raise the age of sexual protection from 14 to 16 years old. This, in my view, is a step towards the kind of civility in our criminal justice system that the Canadians expect. For me and for my constituents, this decision was quite easy. In fact, it's difficult for many to understand why it took so long for government to take this very basic and obvious decision. It is the view of my constituents, and I share it, that children as young as 14 ought to be protected from adults who wish to engage with them in sexual relations. We do not believe, in my constituency, that adults should be permitted to have sexual relations with children as young as 14 years old, and that is why I have joined with the Conservative caucus for many years in fighting for that age to be raised. I'm proud to see that, that Canada's new government, under the leadership of our Conservative Prime Minister, have kept its word to raise the age of sexual protection from 14 to 16. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I'm proud that we acted swiftly to raise the age of sexual protection after years of delay by the previous Liberal government. Mr. Speaker, I think today of our broader criminal justice agenda, which seeks to restore accountability for criminals and protection for victims. Just yesterday, you, Mr. Speaker, raised a private member's bill, an excellent private member's bill, to bring in mandatory jail time for those who steal cars repetitively and are convicted of doing so. And how timely it was for you to raise such a private member's bill, because just yesterday, police in the Montreal area discovered a massive junkyard containing as many as 100 stolen cars. I predict that when this crime is unraveled, we will find that most of those cars were stolen by repeat offenders. Had your tough justice law been in place at the time, many of those repeat offenders would have been behind bars, unable to carry out their systematic theft of private property. Unfortunately, the previous government did not support tough laws to combat criminality, and we were elected on an agenda to fix the flaws of the previous government's justice policy. And so we put forward over a dozen tough-on-crime bills, none of them receiving swift support from the opposition. Many of them continue to languish before a committee. But I'm heartened to see that Conservatives on that committee work hard every day to see those bills passed as soon as possible. They include mandatory jail time for criminals who commit offenses with firearms. They include a 3 strikes you're out bill that says that when someone commits 3 violent or sexual offenses, they should go away for life unless they can prove that they are no longer a danger to society. The onus goes on the criminal instead of on the innocent to prove that he is reformed and able to go out into society. We've put forward a reverse onus bill that says if someone is charged with committing a gun crime, they cannot go back out on the street with cheap bail, but rather them and the danger they bring to society will be kept behind bars until they are acquitted. These are the kind of steps, Mr. Speaker, that my constituents support. Conservatives have always stood for these things. Other parties have joined in supporting such policies at election time. But when the votes are cast and the cameras are off, things seem to change. And that's why it's important for the spotlight to be shone on the other parties, so that Canadians from coast to coast can understand their record on crime and know what they're voting for in the next election. It's not right for people in places like Mississauga to vote for someone they think is going to be tough on crime because that's what he promises on the doorstep, and then find out that later on, in fact, he has been working for exactly the opposite ends. And that's why I'm proud to rise in this place, Mr. Speaker, to remain consistent with the promises that I made to my constituents, to toughen the justice system, to put away the most violent, the most egregious criminals, in particular those who consistently and habitually reoffend. This Prime Minister has led the charge in building tough-on-crime legislation that will restore accountability into our criminal justice system. I know, Mr. Speaker, that you support these initiatives. I know that you are a leading fighter in the cause of restoring public safety in your community. You have been fighting hard to advance the cause of a private member's bill that would mean that people would no longer have to face repeated offenders stealing their cars. Your bill, in fact, would take those offenders right off the street so they could not reoffend. The cost of crime in all of its forms is enormous in both social and financial terms. For example, when the cost of repeat offenders taking cars off the street raises insurance premiums by as much as $70 per person in this country. $70 of your insurance, Mr. Speaker, on your motor vehicle goes to pay for the cost associated with protecting our vehicles against theft. Yet some don't believe we ought to put behind bars those people who habitually steal cars. Some believe those criminals should serve their sentences in the comfort of their living room, in what's called house arrest. I would submit to you, Mr. Speaker, that if someone is willing to steal cars repetitiously, they're probably not willing to honor an edict that they have to stay home, especially when all they have to do is open their front door to carry out the next theft. So I do support your bill, Mr. Speaker, to put mandatory jail time in place for those people who steal cars. I do support three strikes you're out legislation to put behind bars forever dangerous offenders who have committed 3 violent or sexual offenses. And I think it's up to people in this House of Commons to explain why they don't support those measures. In fact, I would encourage them to put a survey in their householder or in their 10%ers to find out how their constituents feel. In fact, I do not think there is a single member of this House of Commons who, if they conducted an objective survey in their constituency, would find that people oppose getting tough on crime. Now, I challenge the members of the House, just as an experiment, to put in their householder a survey or hire a survey company to do it for you. The question on whether their constituents, Mr. Speaker, support 3 strikes you're out legislation that would put violent and sexual offenders behind bars forever if they commit 3 offenses. I would be willing to wager that there's not one single MP that would find their constituents oppose that sort of legislation. Yet, we find that the opposition parties are leading the charge against those kinds of measures. So, Mr. Speaker, we have a difference in values on the question of criminal justice in this House of Commons. We in this House believe in consequences. We in this party, the Conservative Party, and in this government believe in real consequences for hardened criminals. Others believe in a softer approach, which allows the criminal back out on the street in the hope that they might reform themselves. Well, Mr. Speaker, the police, victims groups, and the vast majority of Canadians have issued their verdict on this debate over values, and they overwhelmingly agree with our government in its efforts to crack down on crime. Some point, Mr. Speaker, I'm hoping that in 2009 there will be an election, and I do predict that members of this House from all parties will have a moment of judgment with their constituents on the issue of crime, when they will have to go before their electors in communities across this country, communities like Mississauga, and explain why they spent years blocking government efforts to get tough on crime. And I expect that there will be many angry and betrayed voters who will demand some clear explanations for that decision. And in our democracy, Mr. Speaker, the voter will have the right to act accordingly. On the question of raising the age of sexual protection, Mr. Speaker, our government has moved with as much rapidity as humanly possible to raise the age of sexual protection from 14 to 16. Our government believes, and we are now putting into law, the principle that 14-year-olds ought to be protected from older adult sexual predators. And, you know, for the last 13 years, our party, the Conservative Party, fought hard to raise the age of sexual protection, came up against great resistance from others who were then in the government. But we fought on, and now Canadians have given us the mantle of government, and we followed through with our commitment to raise the age of sexual protection from 14 to 16. Now, Mr. Speaker, I know that the decent people of Nepean Carleton agree with our government's decision to raise the age of sexual protection from 14 to 16. They believe it will make our children safer. And frankly, they don't understand why the previous government refused to take these very same steps. So today, Mr. Speaker, we are debating the passage of this legislation. And once it's passed through the House of Commons, it faces another hurdle, the Senate. It's time for us to start to turn our attention to that question. What will the Senate do when it receives this legislation? Will the Senate execute the will of the Canadian people and pass into law a measure to protect our teenage children from adult predators? Or will they delay, Mr. Speaker? Will the Liberal Senate continue to delay our efforts to protect young people from adult predators? Mr. Speaker, I hope not. I hope that for a change, the Liberal Senate will recognize that Canadians are demanding that the age of sexual protection be raised from 14 to 16. It was promised by this government in the last election. We've delivered. Now we're calling on the unelected Liberal Senate to follow through with the will of the Canadian people and protect our children against adult predators. There's no reason, Mr. Speaker, why the Senate cannot simply pass this legislation early next week, send it back with no amendments, and allow it to be passed into law. There's nothing really to debate here, Mr. Speaker. We're talking about protecting teenage children from adult sexual predators. How can the Senate claim, as they might, that they need months and months to debate, study, and amend such a simple proposition? Mr. Speaker, I am hoping that the other place, the Liberal Senate, will recognize the will of the people, will raise the age of sexual protection, will send this bill back without any changes, and will help us codify this bill into law in the next week. And there is no reason why they cannot. There is no reason why they should not. And I would hope, Mr. Speaker, there is no reason why they would not. Mr. Speaker, I thank you for having given me the floor in this House. I'm honored to represent the constituents of Nepean Carleton, and I celebrate any occasion when I can bring to fruition a promise that I made to them in the last election. So beyond the positive attributes of this bill, the fact that it protects our children, we can also celebrate in a promise made and a promise kept. We said that we would do it, Mr. Speaker. We said that we could do it, and we've done it. Now's the time for the Senate to finish the job, to pass the bill, and to move forward in protecting our youngest and most vulnerable. Mr. Speaker, today I thank you for presiding over this debate and for helping us to carry forward in the completion of yet another promise made and kept. I thank you for this occasion to speak before this House, and I now anticipate the questions and queries of my distinguished colleagues. Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs is rising on a point of order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I apologize for interrupting the debate. I was enthralled with the comments of my colleague from Nepean Carleton. I compliment him on his remarks. But, Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Standing Order 32.2, I am seeking consent to table copies of a document entitled Arrangements for the Transfer of Detainees between the Government of Canada and the Government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. I'll be tabling this in both official languages, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Does the Honourable Minister have the unanimous consent of the House to move the motion? The House has heard the terms. Is it the pleasure of the House to adopt? No. Agreed?
No. You don't need consent.
Why did she give me? The document is tabled. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Northumberland, Quinte West.
Mr. Speaker, I believe the Minister of the Crown just tabled the appropriate document, and I believe that this House should accept the tabling of that document now.
The document has been tabled. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Edmonton-Sherwood Park.
Mr. Speaker, I recognize in his speech that my colleague here has taken on a real mission here in order to support this bill and what it represents. And I would like to say that he is not alone. There are very, very many of us who have had a number of calls from our constituents and indeed letters from people right across this country who want to see the law strengthened in this particular instance. And there have been, during the day of this debate, a number of members of other parties who have been taking, I think, very, very cheap shots at the intent of this legislation. And they've been very vocal in some of their expressions of doubts about whether or not it's a good bill, whether or not it's going to accomplish what it does, and also that it threatens certain of the freedoms that they want to have. And I would like my colleague, if he would please, to just comment on whether or not, in his view, this is a bill that's worth supporting and what his main reasons would be for that. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Nepean Carleton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I note that that member has been working for over a decade to raise the age of sexual protection, because it has been one of his main objectives to defend the most vulnerable in our society. He has fought for tougher laws in our justice system to protect the innocent against the guilty, and he has fought to raise the age of sexual protection from 14 to 16 in order to protect teenagers against adult predators. Now, Mr. Speaker, I am proud that our Conservative government has kept its promise to raise the age of protection from 14 to 16 and to protect our most vulnerable from adult predators. That is the right thing to do. I'm proud to have been part of a government that has done this, and I'm proud to be part of a Conservative Party that keeps its promises. Thank you.
Questions and comments? L'honorable député.
Honourable Member for Jean Lebert. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I had another look at Hansard here to take a look at the votes and proceedings, and I was a little shocked to learn that the member for Nepean Carleton voted last week against the bill that was intended to regulate violence on television. Now, Mr. Speaker, how can you claim to defend the interests of children, to protect them, when you say at the same time, hey, it's okay to have all kinds of violence on TV, even during prime time or very early hours where many young children are watching TV and developing their personality? Is it all right to have this type of programming on with the consent of the CRTC? It seems paradoxical to me. Now, for the Conservatives, for this member in particular, there's a great deal of effort in projecting a tough-on-crime image. I would invite him to take a poll in his riding. Is it better to protect people before or after they commit a crime? It seems to me that there is a complete lack of concern with respect to preventing crime. There we have the issue of the gun registry. We have people who have voted against reducing the amount of violence on television. There are innumerable programs for preventing violence and crime, the rising crime, that have come from groups that need funds from the government, but they have been blocked. They are awaiting the government's decision with respect to funding, and unfortunately, there is no decision on the part of the Minister of Public Safety. What a hypocritical stance this government is taking. They say, oh, we're going to make legislation, enact it so people will stay in prison longer. But the people who perpetrate the crimes in prison longer does not take away the odious nature of what, say, the victims of crime had to deal with. It seems to me, once again, the Conservative government is displaying hypocrisy. I would think that there is doublespeak in this entire matter. The Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasury Board present. Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, there are many regulations that already exist with respect to the level of violence, with respect to violence in general on television. That has always existed. The Conservatives the Liberals rather, did very little to change anything during the 13 years that they were the government in Parliament. And here we have that party that voted against a minimum mandatory sentence for violent offenders who use firearms in the commission of a crime against innocent people. That is the party that voted against all measures to strengthen the justice system. So I take no lesson from the member's party. His words are extreme. His ideas do not represent the values of Quebecers and Canadians.
Party that, along with the Liberals, voted to allow, in committee, to allow arsonists, car thieves, and burglars to do their sentences in the comfort of their homes. Instead of doing those sentences behind bars through mandatory jail time, that party, the Bloc, along with the Liberals, voted in committee that we should allow those people to have house arrest. Now, I would be willing to bet that the grand majority of that member's constituents would tell him that they do not want car thieves, arsonists, and burglars living in their neighborhood doing house arrest. They would rather have mandatory jail time. And that is what our party has stood for. That is what our government stands for. It is what the vast majority of people in this country believe, including in Quebec. And quite frankly, that member is going to have to explain his out-of-touch views in the next election to his constituents when they learn of his record and his party's soft-on-crime record at that time. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Chatham-Kent Essex should know there's 2 minutes left, so maybe half for the question, half for the answer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll make it quite short. We have all been watching this with quite some interest, and I've listened to the member's speech, and we share the concerns that he does as well, that we really have to adjust our attitudes. And I recall an incident, it wasn't all that long ago, when we were discussing the punishment of crime, and I want the member just to maybe comment on some of the remarks that I heard, a reference to prison as being repression. And I heard that reference a number of times from the bloc, and I'm just wondering if the member would care maybe just to comment on that. Is there something I'm missing here? Have we turned a page in history? And maybe you could the member could just, through you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable the Parliamentary Secretary to the President of the Treasury Board.
The problem with the Bloc Québécois
is not only the fact that it can never do anything. That's very clear. Everybody knows that. But there's also this. They have an extreme left ideology that does not reflect the ideas of Quebecers, particularly with respect to crime. They do not support the simple measures that everybody and the majority of people in Quebec and Canada support. That's the Bloc's two problems.
Resuming debate